Hello and welcome to the PR in Lockdown podcast, your guide to PR and communications in a post-lockdown world, produced by Access Studios in collaboration with the PRCA. I'm Rob Double, and in this episode I'm talking to Kate Hartley, co-founder of Polpeo, a crisis simulation company over social and digital media. We are talking all things crisis in this episode. Kate gives us an insight into how the world of crisis communications has changed over the last few months and her judgement of what PR and communications professionals need to look out for in this new reality. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's just quickly have a summary of who Polpeo is and what kind of services Polpeo offers.
Sure. So as you said, we're a crisis simulation company, and what that means is we train brands and agencies on how to communicate through a crisis as it's breaking on social and digital media. And I co-founded this with an amazing woman, Tamara Littleton, who runs a social media agency. My background is corporate comms and reputation management and crisis management. And we realised that there was no way really of a brand rehearsing what it would be like to go through a crisis, particularly these days as it tends to break online very quickly. So we created Polpeo to do that.
And most interestingly, I suppose, is crisis simulations are for crisis. The past few months have been a crisis, I'm assuming, for many companies, or at least maybe they're having to deal with a huge amount of disruption and everything like that. What's the last few months been like for you?
It's been interesting, actually, because our model is virtual anyway. So although we have offices in central London, we're all set up to work from home. Most of our team work remotely. Tamara's entire company is set up as a virtual model. So it's been, in that way, sort of getting to work from home has been absolutely fine. There's been no issue there at all. We had all the tech and everything set up. Most of our simulation technology is all online as well. So that has been fine. What was interesting is that we tended to run workshops where, although people would log on through an internet-based connection, we would usually run them as workshops with people sitting in a room in person, working together to solve the crisis or to defend the brand's reputation through the crisis. And of course, overnight that stopped. So there was a pretty heart-stopping moment towards the end of March where we saw all our simulation schedules looking a bit like one of those flight cancellation things you see in an airport where everything just said cancelled. So that was a kind of bit of a moment. And then we, I think like everybody, took a breath, calmed down, and realised that actually we could completely do this remotely and virtually. So we became expert in Microsoft Teams and Zoom breakout rooms and all those other things overnight, and started delivering. We just slightly kind of changed the delivery model and delivered these simulations remotely.
How hard was that for you? You mentioned that you were virtual or had a large component of virtual capacity, before any of this, but actually moving to a fully virtual model where you're delivering the services like that as well. Was that daunting, and was that quite a challenge in terms of getting through the weeds of how you were going to do it?
I mean, there were some challenges. We had to get very, very, I mean, like a lot of companies, right? We had to get very up to date with things like Microsoft Teams very quickly, which we hadn't used before. But I think because most of our team already worked from home, we already were very used to communicating digitally. That was probably less of a challenge that a lot of companies have faced. And there were some surprising moments as well, I think. When we started doing these remotely, one of our big clients said that actually this was going to open up more markets potentially for us, because you don't have things like associated travel costs or pulling people into a single hotel to do a workshop or over a couple of days. So it's actually opened up new opportunities for us, which was the unforeseen consequence of this, which has been great. But there are always challenges. I mean, anyone who says that COVID hasn't been a challenge to their business is, well, I haven't met anybody who said that. It's been a challenge for everybody. Just the emotional roller coaster, the amount of just the sheer volume of calls you do with people on video now. You don't seem to ever have any downtime. There are those kind of frightening moments when you think, I'm not sure what the future is going to hold. How long are we going to do this for? And also we work all over the world. So we were seeing different markets having different experiences at different times. So that was fascinating too.
You mentioned there about the airport cancellation style view of your the business that you had coming up. How did you deal with that in terms of the team around you? Because I assume that meant for the team as well. There was a very little business around, and there was uncertainties around the fact that the business was not coming in. The leads were obviously all on pause or suspended. How did you deal with that to make sure that people got through it, I suppose, as comfortable as possible, and of course the business in terms of cash flow and everything stayed in a good position?
I mean, cash flow is always the critical thing, isn't it? And we're fortunate that the business is very resilient in that way. We've always been very much, bank the cash and keep it for exactly, well, I don't think anyone predicts a global pandemic, but keep it for any kind of downtime. All our work is project based. So actually that cash flow has always been incredibly important. So we were lucky that we didn't actually worry about that stage of it. Dealing with people is interesting. I'm normally quite an optimist, but I really struggled at the beginning of lockdown. I'm an extrovert. I get my energy from people. Suddenly to not do face-to-face meetings and those things for me was very hard. I'm really lucky that my co-founder is just the most eternal optimist. She's amazing, and she always seems to find the positive. And when I was sort of struggling, she really picked me up, and I think everybody needs that. And I really feel for people at the moment who are on their own at the top of businesses and don't have anybody to talk to like that, because I think Tamara and I Tamara certainly really helped me out, and helped me get through any kind of any dips. And eventually, of course, you just say, actually, this is going to be great and it's all going to be fine, and we just have to do something different and get on with it. So then, of course, dealing with the team around you, there was a bit of uncertainty, but I don't think anyone really thought that this wasn't going to be a resilient business. I mean, this is the business of crisis, and we are in, as you say, the biggest crisis we've ever seen. I think the business was always going to be okay. There was just that little dip at the beginning, which was a bit of a sharp intake of breath at that moment. But then, a week or so later, we realised actually we're going to be fine.
Did any of that business come back after those initial cancellations? Because with the accepting the physical restrictions in that you can't get into a room with people in the way that you were and delivering services in that way, there must have also been the budgetary impact as well, in that a lot of budgets would have been tightened, a lot of purse strings would have been tightened, and training around media and crisis stuff might have been the first thing to actually be scrutinised as can we reduce this or shrink this for the time being. Did the business that was cancelled on that airport style sign actually start to come back, or has it been relatively minimal during the lockdown?
Interestingly, most of it has started to come back. We've delivered some really big simulations through lockdown completely virtually, which has been amazing. And a lot of the business that was cancelled is now coming back for later on in the year, which is great. There are some markets where we're seeing changes, of course. We were doing a lot of work in the travel sector, so clearly that's not coming back anytime soon. There are other areas where businesses said we're going to be doing this, but we're going through a round of redundancies, so therefore we can't do that until that's over. So there have been delays on things, certainly, but mostly that business has come back. And interestingly, we found new business from different markets that have been really resilient.
What's been the most significant new market that you found that you didn't have before, or the new service that you're providing that you didn't have before?
So we're doing a lot in the in Hong Kong and China at the moment. We saw, and of course that's slightly shifting now, what's happening in Hong Kong with a so-called second wave. But actually, initially, that area of the world was coming out of lockdown before we were in Europe. So we started to see business coming in from that area of the world first, and now we're starting to see things improve here as well. We've run simulations in the US as well, but again, all virtually, everybody working from home. And I think once that we got the message out that we could do this completely remotely, then actually it didn't really matter if people were locked down or not. And that's what brands are starting to realise. As long as they have the resilience in their own businesses to, as you say, afford training, then they're going to do that remotely, and it's fine.
Just to say, to ask, the clients that you have that have come back, or they're saying to you, we want to do what we were planning with you. We just want you to push it down the line a little bit later, do it later this year, or do it maybe early next year. Are they planning to do it physically, or are they planning to keep it virtual?
That's a really interesting question. I assumed that people would plan to do it physically, but actually a lot of people are planning to do it virtually. And I think we're seeing this in a lot of areas at the moment, like conferences and all those kind of things, where actually people are saying, we don't need to do all this stuff physically. We don't need to be in a room together. we can do a lot of the things that we were doing in person remotely, and that saves a huge amount of money. That saves, venue costs and as I said, hotel bills and putting people together in a room. And it saves taking 3 days out of somebody's schedule if you have to fly them over from somewhere. They can just do it in a day or a half day. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of this virtual model, which is great for us. I mean, it's much easier to deliver. It means that we can do things in much more easily in different time zones and different locations.
From your perspective of the last few months, more generally, not just within Polpeo, but as you look at the landscape of what's happened, from a crisis perspective, what do you think has been the biggest challenge for companies, in that immediate lockdown phase? And I suppose if you've got any examples of who you thought's done something really well, and maybe also what you've seen which actually hasn't been so good and people not handling it correctly.
I mean, I think like us, a lot of people suddenly saw everything stopping overnight and thought, my God, what are we going to do? There have been lots of examples of people doing terrible things, haven't there? I mean, Weatherspoons and companies like that, Sports Direct, saying that they were going to have to say, trying to force everyone to come into work because they were critical to the health of the nation and those sorts of things. There were some awful stories at the beginning, and I think one of the things that people will remember is how they were treated. I know a lot of people say this, but how they were treated through this period, and I hope that will be the case. I really hope that people do remember. I was talking to a tech consultant the other day who said that their data shows that, and this is quite interesting for PR agencies actually, that those suppliers who stuck by their clients through this difficult time, so who took fee cuts, for example, pay cuts, all those things, and supported their clients, will now be having their contracts renewed rather than being replaced as might normally happen, or reviewed. So they're automatically being renewed because the brands are actually really respecting the fact that they stood by them through difficult times. And I think that's a really interesting data, and that is based on outsourcing data. And that gives me great hope, actually. I think there were some brands that really did behave well. I just sort of from personal experience, we're talking about going back to restaurants and things now, and God, I can't wait to do that. But only going back to places who treated their staff well. So again, I hope that consumer choice will be informed by this. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I really hope it will.
Really interesting stuff. We're going to take a very quick break now, but coming up after, we're going to be chatting to Kate about this transition from lockdown into this new normal, and what the long-term impacts might be on the PR and comms industry as we look to 6 months and a year and perhaps even 2 years ahead. So we'll be back in just a second. Before the break, we were talking a lot about the disruption of lockdown and the impact in crisis communications and how some companies have got it right, some companies have got it wrong. One thing that I'd be really interested to hear from you is what you've heard from brands and PR professionals about the importance of social media and digital, because I think there has been social media in particular has been a huge factor when everyone's at home in lockdown as to communicating and sharing their experiences. Have you noticed in the services that you're providing, the brands you're talking to, that there is a renewed focus on the importance of getting social media and digital right?
Yes, I really have. And there are a number of reasons for that, actually. When COVID first hit, I think brands didn't really know how to respond on social media. They didn't know how to talk to their consumers. And so you've got a huge number of these, this is what we're doing kind of posts. And then I think we all got flooded with those and a bit kind of sick of hearing what brands were doing, because actually we were more concerned about how we were doing through lockdown than how companies were doing. And so that sort of stopped. And then I think brands started to really listen to what people wanted. And that was the key. And people did want reassurance and, information from brands in a kind of limited way. But they also wanted things like entertainment and a bit of light-hearted, stuff to just break the horribleness of all the news that was coming out of pretty much everywhere. So the brands that I think that did really well were the people that really listened set up social listening, really listened and understood what their customers wanted, rather than just pushing out what they wanted to say. And that right there, I think, is the key for any kind of communication in any sort of crisis. And something that I always bang on about to everybody is that as brands tend to think, or companies tend to think from their own point of view first. They tend to think in a crisis, what do I want to say? What do I need to tell people? And actually, what they should be saying is, what do people need to hear? What information do people want from me? And this has been a real lesson in that. I've been talking to clients about this for years and years, but I think this has just been a huge case of this in action, and companies have really realised that they need to listen to what their people want, rather than just push messaging out.
Yeah, I mean, has it changed the way as this whole lockdown period, and also what you've seen in the power of social media and digital, has it shifted the way that you advise brands or individuals on how to deal with and adapt to social media and digital, particularly in the context of a crisis and needing to communicate with external stakeholders and the wider population?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think it has really. I mean, I think we're seeing it on a scale that we've never seen it before. But I've done quite a lot of research. I wrote a book last year called "Communicate in a Crisis," imaginatively. And one of the things
perfect timing, though. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. One of the things that the main thing that I was looking at there was not necessarily how to behave in a crisis, although there's a bit of that, but more how do people behave in a crisis situation. What drives people to behave in the way they do, particularly on social and digital media. And I think we're seeing all the things that I was writing about, which is, I mean, in a way, I'm pleased about that, because I kind of got the research right. But on the other hand, it's awful. What we're seeing. We're seeing huge levels of anxiety that people display in a crisis, but we're just seeing them on a level that we've never seen them before. We're seeing people taking part in kind of shaming behavior, whether that's shaming people for not wearing masks, for example, or for behaving in a certain way. We're seeing that play out in real life and on social media, and we're seeing all sorts of outrage, people being outraged at various things. We're seeing the spread of misinformation like we've never seen before. I mean, that's been a thing obviously for years, but we're seeing it on a scale that we've never seen it before, and in a way that really has a real impact on people's physical health, which is extraordinary. All these things that we're hearing about, whether this medication works, or does this trial work, or is there going to be a vaccine, or does injecting disinfectant actually cure COVID, or was it caused by 5G and Huawei in China, and all these crazy things that we're seeing being spread on social media. And these are all trends that we've been seeing over the last few years, but they're just ballooning at the moment, and they're all just in a way that we've never seen. It's extraordinary.
What's the biggest risk, do you think, for brands, for PRs, when it comes to that social and digital space? I mean, particularly in terms of that crisis context, is there anything that you think's really ballooned? I mean, you've gone through those factors there as the general themes as to what's been happening and how it's accelerated over COVID. But is there anything that you think is a real risk that people should be aware of, and what you do at Polpeo prepares brands for?
I think the biggest thing is the spread of misinformation. I really do, particularly at the moment. And there is misinformation being spread about brands. People are anxious, they are worried, they're frightened, and therefore they're going to start listening to information that confirms their own biases, whether that's political bias or just plain fear mongering. And you see that in relation to COVID, as we've talked about, but you also see it in relation to some really strange other things. So there was an example recently of Wayfair, the home furnishings company, and there was a rumor going around on social media which saw Wayfair trending on Twitter that Wayfair was using its own cupboards, its own cupboards to traffic children, and that the cupboard names, like IKEA names all their furniture, Wayfair names their furniture in the same way, and their furniture was named with girls' names, and this was supposed to be some sort of code for the children that were being trafficked in the furniture. I mean, it was the most bizarre thing, and it gained real traction. And Wayfair had to come out, and put out a statement saying clearly this is not true. But you would never see that sort of thing coming. And although that technically has nothing to do with COVID. I kind of think it does, because they're anxious, they're in a constant state of anxiety, and they're more open to this kind of misinformation than they've ever been before. And I think therefore they're going we're seeing a bigger rise in scams, for example. We're seeing people sharing things. They have no trust in the official information that's coming out, either from government or from the scientific bodies, because they're fearful. So they believe things that kind of feed into that fear. And I think that's a real issue for brands.
What are your priorities as Polpeo in the coming months? You mentioned, I think before the break, and I think that's really interesting, how it's important for you to be in the room with someone and bounce off them and communicate with people that way. Is most of what you're planning in the next few months all virtual? Is that the accepted reality that you are planning for, basically until the end of this year, maybe, or even longer than that?
I think longer than that. I mean, definitely until the end of this year, 100%. I think we've got two or three clients who want to do in-person simulations this year. Whether they'll go ahead, I don't know.
And that's out of, just to give perspective, that's out of...
I mean, that's out of hundreds.
Right.
It's very, very few. I think mostly we're going to be doing this virtually, and I suspect that's going to go on through into next year as well. I think at some point we'll go back to doing both, probably. And I will quite enjoy going back to doing the in-person ones, as I said before. But I think the virtual definitely will continue, and I think agencies should really be prepared for that, actually.
Where is Polpeo at now? Is it are you back to a level where you pre-lockdown in terms of the business you've got coming through and the leads you've got coming through and the bookings you've got in place, or is it slowly but surely picking back up?
Yeah, it's slowly but surely picking back up. I mean, we're not quite back to the levels we were at before lockdown, but we are getting there, and we're projecting them. I think we're doing what a lot of companies are doing this year, and we're kind of scrapping all the forecasts and things that we had at the beginning of the year. I mean, they're kind of meaningless, aren't we? Until we know what's going to happen with COVID and whether we are going to get the second peak, it is a bit meaningless. And certainly, as I said earlier, our markets have shifted. There are some markets we know won't come back, certainly this year. So
is there any particular markets there is there one particular market which is not, you're not planning to see any kind of resurfacing of at all?
Travel.
Yeah, it's the travel.
We do a lot with airlines, hotels, airports, shipping companies, all that kind of stuff. We don't expect that to come back. I'd love that to come back next year. We just don't know. We have no idea really how it's going to shake out. You look at the redundancies in the airline business, for example, and we would never have predicted that a year ago. So I don't think that business will come back anytime soon.
What about let's have a look at the long-term impact of coronavirus, the lockdown, on the PR and communications industry as a whole. And I suppose particularly in your expertise, in your area, the crisis communications and crisis training space. Is there anything that you've identified which you see there is a real clear driving change that's happening in the industry at the moment, caused by COVID or accelerated by COVID, that you expect to continue on for the next few months and for people to really be aware of?
I think there are a few things, actually, and I in a couple of the sort of networking and peer groups that I'm part of, I've noticed a lot of conversations happening around the need to think differently. We've in the PR industry, and I say we because that PR industry is my background. I've been 25 plus years in agencies before co-founding Polpeo, and I think we have had a tendency to do things the same way because that's how they've always been done. And I think this is a chance to really shake up the industry and think differently. I think we're going to think much more about value selling rather than hours selling. There's been a lot of talk about that recently in various forums that I'm part of. And the need to really innovate and productize what we do. So rather than just selling retainers, with a fairly intangible measurement criteria, we need to be really clear about the value that we're bringing. And I think communications has been absolutely critical to brands and organizations through COVID. So in a way, PR has proved its value in some ways, but that's very kind of strategic communications, whereas a lot of PR, I think, sadly, is still seen as media relations, rightly or wrongly. And the value there isn't necessarily proven. And also, we're going to see a totally changed media market. We're going to have to sell new services. If we're seeing media furloughing people, making people redundant, trade organisations shrinking, regional papers shrinking, I think there's going to be a limited scope for media. And we're almost going to go back to what PR was like when I first started, when media relations was just one part of what you did, and actually strategic communications was the critical bit, and also is the bit that gives the most value to the organisation.
Kate, if people wanted to get in touch with you, both personally, but also get in contact with Polpeo, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm on Twitter at Kate Hartley. I am old enough to own my own name on Twitter.
You've nailed it. That is gold. That is to actually have your name on Twitter.
Amazing. Same on LinkedIn. I'm also kate.hartley@polpeo.com if anyone wants to email me. At Polpeo is the Twitter handle for Polpeo. Any of those ways would be fine.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Kate, and thanks so much for listening to the PR in Lockdown podcast. This is an ongoing series, so if you like what you've heard, please do give us a subscribe on your preferred podcast library, or if you prefer video podcasts, just search for us on YouTube, PR in Lockdown podcast, and we'll be there. You'll see Kate and I's smiling faces back at you. But thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you again on the next episode. PR in Lockdown is presented by Rob Double, and the guest this episode was Kate Hartley, co-founder of Polpeo. It is created by Access Studios in collaboration with the PRCA.